I never imagined my life would crumble in a single evening. But there I was, standing in the middle of our living room, clutching a photograph that had fallen out of Tom's briefcase. My hands trembled as I stared at the image. A smiling Tom with a woman I didn't recognize and 2 children who called him Dad, in neat handwriting scrawled on the back. My stomach churned, and the air around me seemed to thicken. I tried to breathe, but each gulp felt like swallowing shards of glass. Tom wasn't just my husband. He was my rock, my partner of 15 years, and the father of our son, Ethan. We had built a life together. A beautiful home, endless late-night talks, and dreams that felt so solid, so tangible. And yet, staring at that photograph, I realized I didn't know the man I had married. The betrayal wasn't immediate. My mind sought out reasonable explanations. Maybe this was a work obligation, a charity event, or some distant relatives I didn't know about. But deep down, the gnawing unease told me otherwise. I wanted to confront him right then and there. But Tom was still on one of his business trips. He traveled often, or so I thought. The photograph was the first thread I pulled, and what unraveled was a double life I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The next few days were a blur of quiet panic and obsessive searching. I started with the basics: his calendar, receipts left carelessly in his coat pockets, and his travel itineraries. The more I dug, the more the cracks in our life became gaping chasms. Receipts for meals at restaurants I'd never been to. A second phone I found hidden in the glove compartment of his car. An email account under a name I didn't recognize. Each discovery was like a dagger to the heart. But I couldn't stop. I needed the full truth, no matter how devastating. I waited until Tom returned, watching him as if he were a stranger in my own home. He kissed me on the cheek, his lips warm but hollow. His smile, once a source of comfort, now felt like a mask he wore for my benefit. That night, while he slept soundly beside me, I unlocked his second phone. The password was our anniversary date. A cruel irony. The messages on the phone confirmed my worst fears. He called her baby, and spoke about their life together in a tone so tender it made my stomach turn. He referenced their children's school events, planned date nights, and even discussed family vacations. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He had an entirely separate family. The pieces started falling into place. His frequent trips, the unexplained expenses, the nights he returned home later than usual. It all made sense now. He had constructed 2 lives, balancing his time and money between 2 homes, 2 women, 2 sets of children. I felt sick, my chest tightening as the enormity of it all sank in. The man I thought I knew was a master of deception. I didn't confront him immediately. I needed a plan. I needed to know more. Over the next few weeks, I followed him, hiring a private investigator when my efforts fell short. The details they uncovered were both damning and surreal. Tom had a modest home in a neighboring suburb, just 40 minutes away from the house we shared. There, he lived as a devoted husband to a woman named Claire, and father to their 2 kids, Maddie and Ben. He had crafted a routine that allowed him to maintain his charade. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were business trip prep days. Time spent with Claire and their kids. Weekends and Tuesdays were reserved for me and Ethan. The level of calculation, the sheer audacity left me breathless. How could he live this way? How could he look me in the eye and lie so convincingly? The day I finally confronted him is etched into my memory like a scar. I waited until Ethan was at a friend's house, creating a bubble of isolation where the walls of our truth could come crashing down. I laid the photograph on the table, along with printouts of the emails and photos from the investigator. Who are they? My voice was a cold, sharp blade. Tom's face paled, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice breaking. "I know everything." He finally spoke, stumbling over his words as he tried to explain. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I love you. I love Ethan." The absurdity of his words made me laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. "Love? You call this love?" I gestured at the evidence on the table. "You've been living a lie, Tom. A lie that's destroyed everything." He tried to justify himself, saying he had fallen in love with Claire before he met me, that their relationship had faded until a chance encounter rekindled it. He claimed he couldn't bear to choose, that he loved us both in different ways. His words were a tangled web of excuses, each one more pathetic than the last. I felt every emotion at once: rage, sorrow, betrayal, disgust. But beneath it all was a painful clarity. My life with Tom had been a mirage, and I could no longer cling to it. In the days that followed, I began the arduous process of unraveling our life together. Lawyers, custody arrangements, financial disentanglements. It was a logistical nightmare layered atop emotional devastation. Ethan, bless his innocent heart, didn't understand why his dad was suddenly absent more often than not. I shielded him from the truth, knowing it would shatter his world as it had mine. As for Tom, he tried to reconcile, promising he would leave Claire and make things right. But his promises were empty, like the man himself. I realized that even if he did choose me, I could never trust him again. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. In the end, I chose myself.
Issues Ethan.
The life we had before may have been a lie, but the future didn't have to be. Tom's double life had stolen so much from me, but it wouldn't steal my hope, my strength, or my ability to rebuild. As I signed the divorce papers, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure. The woman I was before Tom's betrayal was gone, but in her place stood someone stronger. Someone who had faced the darkest of truths and survived. The days after I signed the divorce papers were a strange blend of liberation and sorrow. I thought the hardest part would be leaving Tom, but it turned out the hardest part was facing the void he left behind. 15 years of my life had been wrapped around his presence. His laugh, his habits, his place in our home. Now, every corner of the house felt hollow, like an abandoned stage after the actors have left. Ethan adjusted better than I did, or at least he seemed to. Kids are resilient in ways we don't give them enough credit for. He asked questions at first. Why isn't Daddy here for breakfast? When is he coming back? I tried my best to explain things without revealing too much. Daddy and I both love you very much, but we've decided to live in different houses. The answer never felt enough, but it was all I could offer. What surprised me most were the mundane moments of grief. Seeing Tom's favorite mug in the cabinet or hearing a song we used to play on Sunday mornings. Those small reminders hit harder than any big event. And then there were the nights. The silence was the worst. I used to fall asleep listening to his steady breathing beside me, and now the quiet felt like a cavern I might fall into if I wasn't careful. I tried to distract myself. Friends urged me to get out, to reclaim some part of my life that didn't revolve around Tom. First, I resisted. How could I think about dinners or movies when the foundation of my life had been ripped away? But eventually I gave in, if only to stop the endless cycle of overthinking. My friend Lisa dragged me to a yoga class one evening, promising it would be good for my mind and soul. I didn't believe her, but I went. Yoga turned out to be less about stretching and more about confronting my own thoughts. As I sat in that quiet room surrounded by strangers breathing deeply, I felt the weight of everything I'd been avoiding. My anger, my sadness, my fear of what came next, they all surfaced at once. Tears slipped down my cheeks as the instructor guided us through a meditation about letting go. I wasn't ready to let go, not yet, but for the first time I realized I didn't have to hold on to everything either. Tom reached out more than I expected. At first it was about practical matters, picking up Ethan, sorting through finances. But then the messages started to carry a different tone. I miss you, he wrote one night, after dropping Ethan off. I think about us all the time. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity before deleting it. I couldn't let myself fall into that trap again. Claire reached out too, though in a way I didn't see coming. One afternoon, as I sat in a coffee shop trying to work on some freelance writing, she appeared at my table. I recognized her instantly from the photographs. The same wavy blonde hair, the same cautious smile. I'm sorry for showing up like this, she said, her voice trembling. I needed to talk to you. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her to leave me alone, but another part was curious. Against my better judgment, I nodded, and she slid into the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She fiddled with the edge of her sleeve, her eyes darting around the cafe as if she were afraid someone might see her. Finally, she met my gaze. I didn't know about you, she said, her words spilling out quickly. I swear to God I didn't know. He told me he was divorced, that you and Ethan had moved on. I believed him. Her confession was like a punch to the gut, not because I didn't believe her but because I did. It was just another reminder of how skilled Tom was at weaving his web of lies. "I found out about you a few months ago," she continued, her voice cracking. "I confronted him, and he swore he'd end things with me. But then he didn't, and I don't know. I just couldn't keep pretending. I didn't know how to respond. What do you say to the other woman who, it turns out, was just as much a victim as you?" I wanted to hate her, but sitting there, seeing the tears in her eyes and the guilt etched into her face, I realized she was as broken by this as I was. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything. If I'd known." "It's not your fault," I said, surprising even myself. "He lied to both of us." We sat in silence after that, two women bound together by the same betrayal. She told me she was leaving Tom, that she couldn't continue living the way she had been. Hearing her say that brought me an odd sense of closure. For so long I had thought of Claire as the enemy, the woman who had stolen my husband. But now I saw her for what she really was, another casualty of Tom's deceit. After that meeting, something shifted in me. I stopped checking my phone for messages from Tom. I stopped looking over my shoulder, wondering if Claire or someone else might show up unexpectedly. Slowly, I started to reclaim my life. I took on more freelance projects, volunteered at Ethan's school, and even started a book club with some of the moms in the neighborhood. One day, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I stumbled across a photo album from the early years of my marriage. Flipping through the pages, I saw the smiles, the laughter, the love that had once been so real. I didn't cry, though. Instead, I closed the album and tucked it back into the box. Those memories would always be a part of me, but they didn't define me anymore. Tom still tried to reach out from time to time, but his efforts grew less frequent as the months passed. He moved in with a friend after Claire left him, and though Ethan saw him on weekends, our interactions were minimal. I heard through the grapevine that he had lost his job, that his life was falling apart. A part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad for him, for what we had lost, for the man he could have been if only he hadn't been so consumed by his lies. As for me, life didn't magically become perfect. There were still hard days, still moments when the loneliness crept in. But there were also moments of joy. Watching Ethan score his first soccer goal, laughing with friends over a glass of wine, waking up to sunlight streaming through the window and realizing I didn't have to live under the shadow of betrayal anymore. I learned to trust again, though it took time. I learned to love myself in a way I never had before. And eventually I opened my heart to someone new. A kind, patient man who didn't carry the weight of secrets. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. And after everything I'd been through, real was all I needed. Life has a way of moving forward, even when you feel like you're standing still. The months turned into a year, and the chaos Tom had unleashed on my life gradually faded into the background. I wouldn't say I forgot. It's impossible to forget something that changes you so profoundly, but I learned how to live with it. Like a scar that no longer aches, but still serves as a reminder of the pain. Ethan adjusted in his own way. He grew quieter for a time, asking fewer questions about his father. I worried the change meant he was internalizing everything, bottling it up in ways that might come back to haunt him later. So I enrolled him in a weekly therapy session with a child counselor, hoping it would give him a safe space to talk about whatever he was feeling. He resisted at first, but over time he warmed up to the idea. Sometimes on the drive home he'd share snippets of what they discussed. "Miss Kara says I can have two homes and still feel like I belong to both," he told me one afternoon, his small voice breaking the silence in the car. "But I like our home better." Hearing him say that brought a bittersweet lump to my throat. I reached over to squeeze his hand, grateful that even in the rubble of what had been our family, he felt safe with me. Tom remained in Ethan's life, though their visits became sporadic as Tom's life continued to unravel. He didn't show up for Ethan's birthday party, claiming a last-minute work emergency, though I knew better. By then he had lost the job he'd once prided himself on, the one that gave him the freedom to lead his double life. I didn't tell Ethan the truth. I simply smiled, made an excuse for his father, and threw him the best party I could. What surprised me most was how little I thought about Tom as time went on. In the beginning, his absence had been a constant ache, a shadow that followed me through every moment of the day. But slowly that shadow lifted. I stopped flinching when his name appeared on my phone screen. I stopped replaying our arguments in my head, dissecting every word for hidden meaning. He had taken so much from me, but I refused to let him take my peace. One day, months after our divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected call from Claire. I hadn't heard from her since our coffee shop meeting, and the sound of her voice brought back a flood of emotions I thought I'd buried. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her tone hesitant, as though she wasn't sure I'd want to hear from her. "For talking to me that day. For not blaming me." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure I deserved her gratitude. "You didn't deserve what happened either," I replied finally. "I've been thinking about everything," she continued, her voice soft. "How he fooled both of us, how we both got caught in his lies. I think I needed to talk to someone who really understands what that feels like." We ended up meeting for lunch a week later. An odd but strangely cathartic reunion. Sitting across from her, I realized how much we had in common beyond Tom. We were both trying to rebuild our lives, to create something stable out of the chaos he had left behind. By the end of the lunch, I found myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like forever. Over time, Claire and I developed an unlikely friendship. It wasn't something I had ever expected, but it felt right. She wasn't the enemy I had once imagined her to be. If anything, she was the only person who truly understood the depths of Tom's betrayal. Together we found a strange kind of solidarity, a shared strength that helped us both move forward. In the meantime, I began to rediscover myself in ways I hadn't anticipated. For so many years I had been Tom's wife or Ethan's mom. Roles I cherished but that often overshadowed who I was as an individual. Now I had the freedom to explore that. I took a painting class, something I hadn't done since college. I joined a local hiking group, reconnecting with the love of nature I'd forgotten I had. And slowly I started to feel like me again. One evening after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat on the couch scrolling through photos I'd taken during a recent hike. The mountains, bathed in the soft orange light of sunset, filled the screen, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of contentment. Not happiness exactly, it was too soon for that, but a quiet assurance that I was going to be okay. It was around that time that I met Greg. He was part of the hiking group, a single dad with a quick wit and a kind smile. At first, I kept my distance, wary of letting anyone into the fragile life I was rebuilding. But Greg was patient, never pushing, always meeting me where I was. We started as friends, sharing stories about our kids and trading tips on the best hiking trails. He didn't ask about my past and I didn't volunteer it, not at first. But as the weeks turned into months, I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, as we sat by a campfire during a group camping trip, I told him everything. About Tom, about the double life, about the scars it had left behind. I expected him to pull away, to look at me with pity or judgment. But he didn't. "That's a hell of a thing to go through," he said after a long pause. "But you came out of it stronger. That's what matters." His words stayed with me. For so long I had defined myself by what Tom had done to me, by the pain and betrayal. But Greg saw something else, something I was only beginning to see in myself. Our friendship eventually blossomed into something more, though it wasn't without its challenges. I was cautious, constantly second-guessing myself, afraid of making the same mistakes. But Greg's patience never wavered. He showed me what it meant to be loved without conditions, without secrets or lies. Ethan adored him, which made things easier. They bonded over soccer games and building model airplanes, and seeing them together filled a part of me I hadn't realized was still empty. As the years passed, my life with Tom became a distant memory. I didn't forget. It's impossible to forget something so defining. But it no longer held power over me. I built a new life, one rooted in truth and love and the unwavering bond one shared with Ethan. Looking back, I sometimes marvel at how far I've come. The woman I was on the day I found that photograph feels like a stranger to me now, someone who didn't yet know her own strength, her own resilience. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life doesn't end when the worst happens. Changes, it shatters, it rebuilds. And if you're lucky, it grows into something even more beautiful than before. As life settled into a new rhythm, I found myself reflecting more often, not just on the pain Tom had caused, but on the ways I had grown. My life wasn't perfect, whose is? But it was undeniably mine now. I had taken control in ways I never thought I could. For years, my identity had been so tightly interwoven with Tom's. Now, as I stood on my own, I felt both the weight and the exhilaration of that independence. Ethan continued to thrive in his quiet, steady way. He was growing up faster than I liked to admit, shedding pieces of his childhood with every new milestone. His weekends with Tom became more infrequent as Ethan began to assert his own desires. By the time he turned 13, he asked me one evening, "Do I have to go see Dad every other weekend?" The question stopped me in my tracks. "Why do you ask, honey?" He shrugged, focusing intently on the spaghetti he was twirling around his fork. "It's just, he doesn't really do much when I'm there. Half the time he's working, and the other half he just talks about how tired he is." I hated how much I wanted to say "I told you so," but instead I chose my words carefully. "You know, Ethan, it's okay to talk to your dad about how you're feeling. And it's okay to tell me if you need a break. This is about you too." He looked up at me, his eyes so much like Tom's but free of the shadows his father carried. "I feel bad," he admitted, "but I just don't really want to go." We had a long conversation that night, one where I let Ethan guide the pace. Ultimately, we agreed to cut back his visits and give him more control over when and how he saw his father. It was a difficult adjustment for Tom. He called me in a fury the first time Ethan opted to skip a visit. "You're poisoning him against me," Tom accused, his voice laced with bitterness. "This isn't fair." I kept my tone calm though my blood boiled. "This is Ethan's decision, Tom. He's not a little boy anymore, and he deserves to have a say in his own life." The conversation ended abruptly, as most of our conversations did these days, but I didn't regret standing firm. For so long, I had bent over backward to protect Tom's image for Ethan's sake. Now I realized Ethan was old enough to see things for himself. Greg remained a steady presence in my life, though we were careful about how we introduced our relationship to Ethan. I wanted to ensure he felt comfortable, that he understood Greg wasn't there to replace his father, but to be an additional source of support. Slowly but surely they grew close. Greg's patience with Ethan mirrored the way he had been with me. Gentle, consistent, never pushy. By the time Ethan was 15, he had started calling Greg for advice about things he wouldn't bring to me, like girls and sports and how to deal with his first real argument with a friend. Watching their bond grow brought me a quiet joy I hadn't anticipated. And yet, as much as my life had evolved, Tom remained a shadow on its edges. He struggled more with each passing year, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to rebuild himself in the aftermath of his double life. He drifted between jobs, and though he continued to make an effort to see Ethan, the effort became less consistent. Sometimes I worried about the impact this would have on Ethan's self-esteem, on his sense of what a father should be. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Ethan asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you think Dad's ever going to get better?" I muted the TV, turning to face him. "What do you mean by better, sweetheart?" He hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "I don't know. Like happier, I guess. He always seems sad, like he's stuck. I feel bad for him, but I don't know how to help." His words hit me harder than I expected. Ethan, with his big heart and kind soul, was trying to carry a burden that wasn't his to bear. "Ethan," I said gently, "your dad's happiness isn't your responsibility. I know you love him, and I know you want to help, but he's the only one who can decide to change his life." He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I just wish things were different." "So do I admitted. "But what matters most is that you don't let his choices weigh you down. You have your own life to live, and it's okay to focus on that." It wasn't a conversation that fixed anything, but it was an important one. I hoped it planted a seed in Ethan's mind, a reminder that he didn't have to carry the weight of his father's struggles. As the years went on, the distance between Tom and Ethan grew, not out of malice but out of the natural drift that happens when one person keeps stepping back while the other moves forward. By the time Ethan left for college, their relationship had become a series of sporadic phone calls and the occasional holiday visit. I mourned for what could have been, for the father-son bond that never fully formed. But I also knew it wasn't my battle to fight. Greg and I, meanwhile, built a life together that was steady and warm, filled with the kind of love I hadn't realized I was missing. He proposed to me on a quiet autumn morning, during a hike we had taken to celebrate 3 years together. The moment was simple and unassuming. Just the two of us on a cliff overlooking a valley painted in the fiery hues of fall. "I don't want to rush you," he said as he held out the ring. "I just want you to know that I'm all in. Whenever you're ready." Looking into his eyes, I saw none of the deceit or manipulation that had defined my relationship with Tom. What I saw was trust, respect, and a love that had grown slowly like a tree taking root. I said yes. Our wedding was small, just close friends and family gathered in a sunlit garden. Ethan walked me down the aisle, his face glowing with pride. As I looked out at the people who had stood by me through everything, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I had fought for, and one I was proud to call my own. Tom didn't attend the wedding, though he sent a brief text congratulating me. I didn't reply, but I appreciated the gesture. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the distance we had traveled, separately, but still tied by the threads of our shared past. In the end, life didn't offer me a clean, perfect resolution. There were still moments of heartache, still memories that stung when they resurfaced. But those moments became smaller, less significant, against the backdrop of the life I had built. I had learned to live with the scars, to carry them not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as proof of what I had survived. And for that I was grateful. Years passed and life continued to unfold in its unpredictable, bittersweet way. Ethan graduated from college with a degree in engineering, his eyes filled with the kind of hope and determination that only youth can carry. Watching him walk across that stage, clad in his cap and gown, was one of the proudest moments of my life. Greg sat beside me, his hand clasped in mine, cheering just as loudly as I was. I thought back to the early years, to the tears and heartbreak and fear of whether I could hold it all together for Ethan. In that moment I knew I had. More than that, I knew Ethan had held himself together too. He had become the kind of man I always hoped he would be. Strong, compassionate, and quietly resilient. Tom was there too, though he sat at the back of the auditorium, his presence subdued and distant. He had made an effort to come, which I appreciated, but he looked older than his years. His hair had grayed prematurely, his shoulders slouched under the weight of his choices. He caught my eye as we filed out of the auditorium, giving me a small nod. I returned it, unsure of what else to do. The man who had once been my whole world was now little more than a faint figure in the rearview mirror of my life. Ethan invited Tom to the small celebration we hosted at home later that evening. To my surprise, Tom came, though he lingered on the edges of the gathering, sipping water and making polite conversation. When Greg approached him, offering a handshake and a genuine smile, I held my breath, wondering how Tom would respond. To his credit, Tom shook Greg's hand and thanked him for taking care of them. It wasn't the kind of grand apology or redemption story you might see in movies, but it was enough. Greg, ever gracious, simply replied, "We're all doing our best." After Ethan moved out to start his first job, the house felt quieter. I missed the sound of his laughter, the constant hum of his presence. Greg and I adjusted to this new phase of our lives, finding comfort in each other, and in the routines we had built. We traveled more, exploring places I'd only dreamed of visiting. The rugged cliffs of Ireland, the bustling streets of Tokyo, the sun-soaked vineyards of Tuscany. Each trip was a reminder of how far I had come, not just physically but emotionally. Claire and I remained friends, an unlikely but enduring bond. She had moved on as well, finding her own version of happiness in a new city with a man who adored her. We kept in touch through long phone calls and the occasional visit, sharing updates about our lives and reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought us together. Tom, meanwhile, faded further from the picture. Ethan kept in touch with him sporadically, but their conversations became more about obligation than genuine connection. When Ethan married a few years later, Tom attended the wedding but left early, his presence more of a formality than a true contribution. I watched him go with a mixture of sadness and relief. He was a ghost of the man I had once loved, a cautionary tale about what happens when deceit consumes you. Greg, on the other hand, became the steady rock Ethan leaned on as he navigated adulthood. When Ethan's first child was born, a beautiful baby girl named Lucy, Greg was there at the hospital, pacing the hallway with me as we waited for news. When the nurse finally announced that mother and baby were healthy, Greg pulled me into a hug, his eyes misty with emotion. "Grandma," he teased, grinning at me. How does it feel? I laughed through my tears, overwhelmed by the joy of the moment. Life had a way of surprising me even after everything I had been through. Over time, my life became defined not by the pain of the past, but by the love and resilience of the present. The scars remained, but they no longer defined me. They were simply part of the tapestry of my life, woven alongside the threads of hope, healing, and new beginnings. One day, while sorting through some old boxes in the attic, I came across the photograph that had started it all, the one of Tom with Claire and their children. I held it in my hands for a long moment, studying the faces that had once brought me so much anguish. I didn't feel anger or sorrow anymore, only a quiet acceptance. This photograph represented a chapter of my life, but it wasn't the whole story. I slid the photograph back into the box, sealing it shut. It belonged to the past, and I had no intention of letting it define my future. My life was fuller than I could have imagined, filled with love, family, and the hard-earned wisdom that comes from surviving the unimaginable. As I descended the attic stairs, I found Greg waiting for me in the kitchen, humming softly as he prepared dinner. The smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs filled the air, and I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. This was my life now, imperfect, messy, and achingly beautiful. Greg looked up, smiling as I entered the room. "What's that look for?" he asked, setting down a wooden spoon. "Nothing," I said, crossing the room to kiss him on the cheek. "Just, I love you." He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "I love you too," he murmured, and in that moment I knew it was true. Love didn't have to be perfect to be real. Just had to be honest, and ours was. As the years stretched on, I found peace in the life I had rebuilt. I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had chosen to create. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Life moved forward as it always does, but it brought with it a kind of tranquility I had never expected. The whirlwind of pain, betrayal, and rebuilding had finally settled into something resembling calm waters. I often thought about how much had changed, how I had transformed from the woman who once cried herself to sleep over a life shattered by lies, into someone who had built something entirely new from the wreckage. It wasn't easy, and there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when the weight of it all would resurface. But those moments were fleeting, and they no longer defined me. Greg and I continued to grow together, our bond deepening with each passing year. Our life wasn't dramatic or grand, but it was rich in its own way. We spent weekends gardening, tackling home improvement projects, or hosting barbecues for friends and family. I had always thought love had to be a whirlwind, a passionate storm that swept you off your feet. But with Greg, I learned that love could also be steady, like a river carving its path over time, shaping everything it touched. Ethan and Lucy became the center of my world. Watching Ethan become a father was one of the greatest joys of my life. He approached parenting with a quiet confidence, so different from the way I had stumbled through those early years with him. I saw shades of my younger self in his wife, Laura, determined, loving, and maybe a little too hard on herself at times. But she was a wonderful mother, and the love she and Ethan shared reminded me that, despite everything, I had done something right. Lucy was a ball of energy, with curls that bounced when she ran and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. She called me Grammy in her high-pitched, toddler voice, and every time she said it, my heart melted a little more. She adored Greg, following him around the house and helping him with whatever project he was working on. The two of them built birdhouses together, painted flower pots, and even started a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Watching them together filled me with a quiet kind of happiness I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. As for Tom, his presence in my life had dwindled to almost nothing. Ethan kept in touch with him sporadically, mostly out of a sense of duty rather than any real connection. Tom had moved out of state a few years after Ethan's wedding, seeking what he called a fresh start. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had struggled to hold down a job and had alienated most of the people who had once been close to him. I didn't wish him ill. I had long since let go of the anger that used to burn so brightly, but I also didn't mourn the distance between us. Some wounds are best left unexamined. One day, I received a call from Ethan that brought Tom's name back into my life in an unexpected way. "Mom," he began, his tone hesitant, "I got a call from Dad's neighbor. He's in the hospital. It sounds serious." I sat down, my heart sinking. What happened? Apparently, he collapsed at home. The neighbor said it's something with his heart, but I don't know much else. I was thinking of flying out to see him. I thought you'd want to know. The old me, the woman who had once loved Tom so fiercely, might have rushed to his side without a second thought. But the woman I was now hesitated. I wasn't sure what I owed him anymore, if anything. Still, the news stirred something deep within me. A mixture of concern and a lingering sense of unfinished business. Do you want me to come with you? I asked finally. Ethan paused, then said, only if you want to. I'll be okay either way. The next morning I found myself boarding a plane with Ethan, unsure of what I would say to the man who had once been my everything. When we arrived at the hospital, the sight of Tom took my breath away, not because of affection, but because of how fragile he looked. The man who had once commanded every room he walked into now lay in a hospital bed, his face pale and sunken, his body frail. Hi, Dad, Ethan said softly, stepping to his bedside. Tom's eyes fluttered open, and he managed a weak smile. Ethan, he rasped, his voice barely audible. You came. Ethan sat with him, holding his hand and speaking in hushed tones. I hung back, unsure of my place in this moment. When Tom finally noticed me, his eyes widened in surprise. Sarah, he whispered. You didn't have to come. I know, I said simply, taking a seat near the window. But I'm here. For a long time we didn't speak. Ethan filled the silence with updates about Lucy and life back home, his voice steady and calm. When he stepped out to make a call, Tom turned to me, his expression unreadable. I never meant for it to end this way, he said, his voice tinged with regret. With us. With everything. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of the pain he had caused. But another part, the part of me that had healed, felt only sadness. We can't change the past, Tom, I said quietly. But I hope you find peace. He nodded, his eyes misting over. I hope you have too. I have, I replied, and for the first time I realized it was true. Tom passed away a few days later. Ethan stayed to handle the arrangements, and I stayed with him, not for Tom's sake, but for my son's. The funeral was small and somber, attended by a handful of people who had known Tom in his final years. As I stood by Ethan's side watching him say goodbye to his father, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. In the years that followed, life continued to bloom in ways I hadn't expected. Lucy grew into a spirited, intelligent young girl who shared her father's curiosity and her grandmother's stubborn streak. Greg and I celebrated our 10th anniversary with a trip to Greece, where we spent long sun-drenched days exploring ancient ruins and laughing over glasses of wine. As I sat on a quiet beach one evening, watching the waves lap against the shore, I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. The heartbreak, the healing, the love I had found again. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that had finally come together. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for that I was endlessly grateful. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, I let myself smile. The journey had been long, and the road had been hard, but I had made it. I had survived. And in the end, I had found something far greater than I ever thought possible. Peace. The years continued to flow like a gentle river, each one carrying me farther from the pain of my past and deeper into the life I had built. Lucy grew up before my eyes, transforming from a precocious little girl into a bright and determined teenager. She had her father's analytical mind, always curious, always asking questions, but her heart was pure kindness like her mother's. Watching her grow gave me a sense of pride I hadn't known was possible, and with each milestone, her first piano recital, her first school dance, her first college acceptance letter, I felt a part of my own soul heal in ways I didn't expect. Ethan thrived in his role as a father and husband, balancing the demands of his engineering career with the tender devotion he showed to his family. He would call me often, sometimes just to chat about the little things. A new project at work, a funny story about Lucy, or a memory he had stumbled upon from his own childhood. Those calls were my lifeline, a reminder that, despite everything, I had done something right. I had raised a man who understood the value of love and honesty. Greg remained my steadfast partner, my calm in every storm. As the years passed, our relationship deepened into something I could only describe as profound companionship. We were two people who had weathered life's worst storms and come out stronger on the other side. We didn't need grand gestures or declarations. The quiet comfort of sitting together on the porch, watching the sunset, was enough. We eventually downsized to a smaller house, a cozy cottage on the edge of a lake. It was a place that felt like a dream, sunlight streaming through the windows, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, and the scent of wildflowers in the air. Greg and I spent our days gardening, kayaking, and hosting visits from friends and family. Lucy loved coming out to the lake, bringing her friends and later, boyfriends, for weekends filled with laughter and storytelling around the fire pit. One summer evening, Lucy and Ethan came to visit, bringing Laura and Laura's parents along. We had a full house, the kind of bustling, lively energy that made the cottage feel even more alive. As we gathered around the dinner table, passing plates of grilled fish and fresh vegetables, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we had all come. "Grammy," Lucy said, breaking me out of my thoughts, "tell us a story from when Dad was little." I smiled, glancing at Ethan, who groaned dramatically but didn't protest. "Well," I began, leaning back in my chair, "there was this one time when your dad decided he wanted to build a treehouse all by himself. He must have been about 9 years old and he was determined. He borrowed tools from the garage without asking, and let's just say it didn't go exactly as planned." The table erupted into laughter as I recounted the tale, complete with Ethan's attempts to hammer nails into a tree while standing on an unsteady stack of cinder blocks. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of a simpler time before everything fell apart. But as I looked around the table, I realized that what I had now was even more beautiful than anything I had lost. Over time, my reflections on Tom became less about the pain he caused and more about the lessons he inadvertently taught me. His betrayal had forced me to confront my own strength, to rebuild my life piece by piece, and to rediscover who I was outside of our marriage. I no longer thought of him with anger or sorrow, only a quiet sense of forgiveness, not for his sake but for mine. Carrying the weight of that bitterness had been exhausting, and letting it go was the greatest gift I could have given myself. In my later years, as the lines on my face deepened and my steps slowed, I found a sense of contentment I had never thought possible. Life wasn't always easy, but it was full of love, of laughter, of quiet moments that reminded me of how precious each day was. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since before Ethan was born. At first, it was just for me, journals filled with memories and reflections, but eventually I began to share my stories with others. One day Greg suggested, "Why don't you write a book? You've got enough stories to fill a dozen." The idea terrified me, but the more I thought about it, the more it excited me. Writing became my new passion, a way to pour all of my experiences, both the painful and the beautiful, onto the page. My first book, a memoir of sorts, was published when I was 65. I didn't expect it to resonate with anyone beyond my family and friends, but to my surprise, it found an audience. Letters poured in from women who had faced their own betrayals, who saw pieces of themselves in my story. "Your book gave me hope," one woman wrote. "I've been stuck for so long, but now I feel like I can start moving forward." Those letters meant the world to me. They reminded me that even the darkest chapters of our lives can have meaning, that our pain can become a source of light for others. As the years turned into decades, my family continued to grow. Lucy married a kind, thoughtful man who adored her, and they had 2 children of their own. Seeing my great-grandchildren play on the shore of the lake, their laughter echoing across the water, was a joy I could never have imagined during those dark days after discovering Tom's betrayal. Eventually, my body began to slow in ways even my willpower couldn't overcome. I spent more time sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the world around me with a sense of gratitude that went deeper than words. Greg, ever by my side, held my hand through every ache, every difficult moment. We had shared a life that was rich not in material wealth, but in love and resilience. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in hues of gold and lavender, I turned to Greg and whispered, "We've had a good life, haven't we?" He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The best," he said. And in that moment I knew it was true. Life hadn't gone the way I had planned, but it had gone exactly as it needed to. It had been messy and beautiful, filled with heartache and joy, and I wouldn't have traded it for anything. When my time finally came, I left this world surrounded by the people I loved, My family, my friends, my Greg. And though I was gone, I knew the life I had built, the love I had poured into the world would carry on. It was a legacy not of perfection, but of resilience, of hope, and of a woman who refused to let her past define her future. As the years I had built with love, resilience, and hope came to a close, I found myself reflecting on the threads of my life, the heartbreaks, the triumphs, and everything in between. Life had been messy and unpredictable, yet it had offered me beauty in unexpected places. In my final days, I spent hours on the porch overlooking the lake, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. Lucy brought her children to visit often, and they ran through the yard with the same energy she once had, their laughter carrying across the water. Ethan was a constant presence, sitting with me quietly, holding my hand and sharing memories. Greg, ever my rock, rarely left my side, tending to me with the same unwavering devotion he had shown me for decades. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in soft golden light, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. My family gathered around me, Ethan, Lucy, their children, Laura, and Greg. The room was filled with love, the kind of love that transcended the pain and struggles that had shaped my journey. Greg leaned close, his voice soft. "I love you, Sarah. I always have, and I always will." "I love you too," I whispered, my voice barely audible but filled with all the gratitude and affection I could muster. I looked around the room one last time, my heart swelling with pride for the family I had raised, the life I had lived. There was no sadness, no regret, only a deep, abiding gratitude for everything. As I closed my eyes, the sounds of laughter and the gentle lapping of the lake became a soothing lullaby. I drifted into a quiet, eternal rest, carried by the love of those who surrounded me. In the days that followed, my family mourned, but they also celebrated the life I had lived. They gathered by the lake to share stories, laughter mixing with tears as they remembered the woman I had been. Not perfect, but strong, loving, and endlessly resilient. Greg stayed in the cottage, tending to the garden we had built together and watching the sun rise and set over the lake, always feeling my presence beside him. And so my story ended not in sorrow, but in the quiet joy of a life well lived. It was a legacy of love, forgiveness, and the courage to rebuild, proving that even in the face of the deepest betrayals, life can be beautiful again. And it was.